tried to put together kind of a timeline, and we never kept a journal. I wish we would have, but didn't take time to write anything down. So most of it is from memory and photographs that have dates on them. There's pictures here that if you want to look at afterwards, some of the phases that we went through. The earliest thing that I can remember is maybe when I was 4 or 5 years old. I don't think we have much memory before that time. But I remember upstairs in the granary was a stack of 1 gallon tins piled higher than my head, way up there. Of course, I was only that high then, I suppose. How many were there? I don't remember. I don't know. 100, 200, 300 maybe. And also a pail of homemade spouts that were made out of galvanized tin. I think they were shaped over an inch or an inch and a quarter pipe, quite heavy. And I remember my dad had a coal chisel made in the shape of a U. We drill a hole in the tree and then take off the bark underneath the hole and make a track with that coal chisel into the wood. And then that spout would fit in that little track that we made into the bark. And that would carry the sap into the bucket then. So that's how the sap was collected at that time. I remember the pile of pails and a bucket there of homemade spouts. My dad said the first place he made maple syrup was underneath a pine tree. And in a cradle with a few stones laid up to hold a pan, and that little stone depression in the ground is still there, you can see it. A few years later, the first building that I remember was a little farther out into the woods. I remember it didn't have a floor in it, just a dirt floor, but it had a concrete base to put a 4x10 pan on it, flat pan. That was there for a few years and just don't remember how long. The one we have a picture of was closer to the edge of the woods. That had a concrete firebox and there was a concrete floor in it. There's a picture of that building with some of the neighbors that were gathered around. I imagine on a Sunday or something, there was about 10 of them there in the picture. I'm sure they weren't all working because with just a few hundred pails, they wouldn't need that much help. The concrete foundations are still visible for the first 3 locations. The third location was built, my dad went into partnership with my mother's cousin. He had 80 acres of solid maple, almost solid maple. And at that time, that was in 1938. No, before 1938, 35 to 38. In 1935, they bought 2,400 new pails, much like this here, only they were 12 quarts. Anybody want to guess what they paid for those pails at that time, 1935 or 36?
75
How much?
75 feet.
19 cents a piece. And the cover, a nickel. So that was a big investment in 36. 2,400 of them they bought. And we built the building. My dad built the building then with his partner about 2 miles away from where we live now. That was where the 80 acres of timber was. And they built the building, I don't know the size, but there was 4 concrete arches in there with railroad rails for grates. Each arch had a 4x10 pan on it, and they were built in steps. So the first one was up there, the third one here. So when this one went, at one time they had fire in all 5 of them, or all 4 of them. And when this one went low, then they drained it down to the next one and kept on until they finished off in the 4th one. And after a couple of years, they added on another one, so eventually there were 5 arches in that one building with 5 fires, 5 4x10 pans. You can imagine the wood they burned, compared to an evaporator. The concrete there is still visible, very visible. Then in 1946, 46, 48, my dad, the salesman come around selling evaporators. Had never heard of an evaporator before that. Heard of them, but never knew where to buy one. The internet wasn't, we didn't have it at that time. So I remember the salesman came, and when he left that day, he had sold my dad a 5x16 King evaporator. My mother's cousin didn't want to invest any more money in the thing, so the partnership was dissolved. We built a new building at home then in 48, 49. When we were tapping 2,400 at my mother's cousins there, then eventually we added 600 at home. The 600 that he had been tapping before, when they were in the partnership, they did not use those. But then in the last year or two, they added those 600. That was when they added the 5th firebox on the other location. But then when my mother's cousin didn't want to be a part of it anymore, why, they built a building at home, 1947. The building was 24 by 30 or 40. I know it was 24, but how the other dimension not sure of. At that time, we were tapping 3,000 taps. And then we bought an adjoining 80 that joined our property to the south, and the number got up to 4,500. Things were going along well, and on the 9th of April, 1952, we had a fire. Burned the evaporator house down. We had made a couple hundred gallons of syrup, and that was lost. The evaporator wasn't totally destroyed because the bottom part had a couple inches of sap in it, and that survived the fire. The top part had to be rebuilt, but we made it usable. In about 3 days, we were back making syrup again. Found a used evaporator someplace, and so we had two evaporators going at that time. So the 6th building then was the one that's still there, 24 by 60. We had two 6 by 16 lever evaporators in there. And then on 10th of May, 1953, tornado hit, and we lost half of our taps. The rented land that had 200 or 2,400 taps on it was totally destroyed, and we lost about half of those that we had at home. So we bought another 80 acres. It was 3.5 miles away, and then we rented small tracts from other farmers that had maples available. So about till the 70s, we were tapping 7,000. 76, we bought 110 acres that were 22 miles away, brought our total taps up to 10,000 at home. And in 1962, we rented some land down near Osceola, just across from Osceola in Minnesota. And we had 7,000 taps there. We cooked there, we gathered the sap there. We did that for 22 years at 17,000. But help started to be hard to get. At one time we had a list of people who wanted to work in the spring, and we had a list of probably 15, 20 people that wanted to work, and had 4 or 5 that were good workers that were there every year, year in and year out. So whenever we needed help, we just called them up and they'd show up. But in the 80s, then that story changed. That help wasn't available anymore, so after 22 years down at the Minnesota location, we dropped that one and just tapped the 10,000 at home. That continued then until...
When I met you, or
Pardon me?
1962 was when I met you.
Ah,
First
okay,
I worked for Irvin Hermstead.
yeah. That was about the time we were at our peak tapping, in the 60s and the 70s. And during the, I guess during the late 80s and the early 90s, then we were starting to sell so much more syrup than we were able to make. I think we were making about 10% of our needs, and we were working, it seemed like 11 months to make 10% of our syrup. And seemed like it was easier to buy our syrup from other people and just put all our efforts into marketing. This was the first syrup, the first jar. No, it was not the first jar. I don't ever remember that we packed syrup in quart jars, mason jars, and things like that. Always used a syrup type jar. This one here is, the first ones I remember were just like this. And this was the top one here, the big top with the handle on the top. And then a few years later, they changed the design and made it like this. And I remember that these bottles were sold at the grocery store in Minneapolis for 25 cents a piece. That was a pint in there. My dad sold them to the store for 19 cents, and the store retailed them out for 25. The store that we were selling syrup to at that time, bring all the syrup you can make, we could sell it. It was an upscale store, grocery store. It was Hoves at that time, which now has turned into Lund's. Shopping was totally different. When the syrup was available, the customers would come and buy their year's supply when the syrup was available from the store. In the fall, they would deliver truckloads of potatoes there. And people would come and buy 100 pounds of potatoes or 200 pounds of potatoes, whatever they need for the year. They wouldn't go to the market every day for some of those seasonable items, and maple syrup was one of them. So that store is what put us in the maple syrup business, because all we could make went to that store. Well, we kept on making more and more and more. Finally, it got to be they couldn't take all the syrup we made, so then we started going to other stores. And it just sold syrup in...
How did you get the syrup there?
My mother's cousin had a pickup. And I remember loading that pickup to the Dills, and he'd make a trip down there and deliver it to the store. I don't know if he made 1 trip, 2 trips, or 3 trips, but I remember that pickup. Old International half-ton pickup that I'm sure was hauling more than it should have been. These jars, it came 24 in a case. That was a big case because it's a short, squatty jar. It's a big case. 1957, 55, 56, we started looking at our income tax, and we were selling us more income from our syrup in part than we were from the dairy. We had 25 cows, a total of about 100 head of livestock. 1957, we sold our cows. So since 1957, our total income has been made from maple syrup. We've never had a job outside the farm. Neither my wife or I had worked at anything except selling maple syrup, making syrup, cutting wood. For how long has it been? Too long, huh? 60 years, 70 years, 80 years. Any other, that's all I can share with you right now.
Norman, when you started, how did you haul the sap in the woods, and then what's the progression that you went through?
Until 1964, we used horses. We had 2 teams of our own. We had one neighbor that had horses. We just rented his every year. And then it seemed like every spring we would find somebody who had a team of horses they were willing to have us use for the year.
Then you had a bobsled with tank on it, or?
No, used four-wheel wagons.
Oh,
Oh, never used a stone boat or sleigh, or, I guess we used a sleigh at a time or two early to gather sap, but most of the time, four-wheel wagons. Then after, when we made the switch, we switched to tractors with half-tracks on. We don't think we ever used tractors and chains, we always had half-tracks. We had 6 tractors with half-tracks on, 2 at the Minnesota location, 2 at the Barron location, and 2 at the farm location. And they worked well for us.
I have a question regarding the trees. I noticed that you said you could tap box elder, but isn't the quality of the syrup dependent upon the tree? So I don't know the difference between like sugar maple and the silver maple and stuff like that. And what about the new hybrids, like the red maple and the different things that you can buy out of the garden centers? Does it
Well, we
matter?
only had 2 types of maple, what we call the hard and the soft maple. We never had any box elder, and so I have no experience with that. The sap that we get from the 2 types of trees that we had, it's all the same as far as we're concerned. But the other varieties, yeah,
Do you have to have 1 bucket for each tree, or can you have?
I think we averaged 2 buckets to a tree. Lots of trees had
So
3.
what I'm saying is you couldn't have 2 trees attached to 1 bucket, or is that?
No, we never did that,
Never did that, okay.
no. Because you just couldn't keep up.
What is the earliest you remember tapping the tree in the spring? What was the earliest?
As far as getting sap, I think probably be about the 20th or 15th and 20th of March to cook. But the latest I remember was the 10th of April. That was 65 or 66. We had snow clear up the kazoos, and it all went at one time. I remember coming, at that time we were cooking at the Minnesota location, coming home from there, and the REA building at Centuria was flooded because the snow wouldn't let the water away, and there was water in the building there. These pails here was part of we bought them from Sugar Bush Supply in Michigan. We bought 3,000 of them new at one time, and I remember they said afterwards it was one of the biggest orders they ever had at one time for pails. And I think we paid at that time 68 cents a piece for them. And it came to Luck here, delivered to the railroad station here in Luck. What year it was, I'm not sure, but there's the evidence right there.